two panelists from pretty much the opposite ends of the very broad spectrum of autonomous vehicle companies. We have Taggart Matthiesen from Lyft. And we have Charlie Janac from Arteris. And I'm going to have these guys tell you guys a little bit more about what they do. They can do it better than I can. And I am the one who got stuck with the funny scene, as you predicted would happen.
Oh, you did get the seat. Look at that. All right, so my name is Taggart Matthiesen, Director of Product at Lyft. I'm responsible for kind of the product side of autonomous. What does that mean? Basically helping us extend our network to bring on autonomous vehicles as well as kind of the passenger experience. Been at Lyft for about 2 years. Prior to that, helped build out the data platform at Twitter, and before Twitter, Salesforce for about 9.5 years. So if any of you are using that, that was my fault. Sorry.
And my name is Charlie Janac. I'm President and CEO of Arteris IP. And we make networks that operate inside semiconductor chips. So we're about in 70% of all the smartphones you guys are using. But around 2012, we decided to focus on automotive. And we are in majority of the ADAS semiconductor projects. The things that we impact are resilience, which is making these chips functionally safe. We impact security in some ways, even though that's a big stack that keeps these chips safe from a hardware perspective. Before this, I was employee number 2 of a company called Cadence Design Systems, and I ran a robotics company called Smart Machines, and that's that.
Okay, great. So neither of you guys are autonomous vehicle companies per se. So I wanted to start by just having you talk a little bit about how autonomous cars fit into the broader range of your business and how it's already changed what you guys are doing now. I guess we'll start here.
I'll start. Well, I think before I talk about the business, I kind of think about autonomous vehicles today and the impact that I think they'll provide. So safety, and Raquel mentioned this yesterday, if you look at vehicle fatalities, last year I think there was about 1.5 million. If you look at accidents, it's between 20 and 50 million as well. And what's interesting in 2015, 2016, if you combine those years, there's actually been an increase of, I think it's like 14% of deaths. And the challenge is that we're all, and probably most of you in the audience right now are doing that as well, which is multitasking. And I think the reality is that time is really important for us. Time is really important for Lyft's passengers as well. And I think the interesting thing with autonomous is that it's going to help us get our time back. So there's this safety aspect. I think there's also this time aspect as well. And we kind of see that today with transportation as a service of how do you kind of reinvent how people go from point A to point B, where you're not driving a car, you're actually doing something valuable with your time. So I think autonomous is going to be really, really important and something that's key, I think, to our service.
Sure.
So the autonomous car, I think, is going to change the world more than the smartphone will, or it has, and ranks along with the internet and the PC and fire and the wheel and the printing press as a long-term evolutionary trend. And just to put another number of what Taggart just said, those accidents, the 40,000 deaths roughly in the U.S. every year, and 2 to 3x factor of accidents, cost about $871 billion to the U.S. economy, and more so in the third world, where the rate of fatalities are even higher, right? So this is why it has to happen. What gets me excited is that we think that we can save 80 to 90% of those fatalities. Think about that we could save 30,000 people, 27,000 people a year. And just to put a historical number on it, there were 40,000 people who died, U.S. soldiers in the Vietnam War, right? So the economics of this thing are so compelling that it has to happen. But it is complex. There are going to be many twists and turns, and there's going to be hype cycles, there's going to be up cycles, down cycles, but ultimately this is going to be one of the most meaningful changes in how we move people and goods in the history of the world.
Okay, great. So that's kind of the very long term. Here's where we're going to end up. I feel like that is a very tempting place to take every conversation about autonomous vehicles, and I want to get there for sure. But I want to start kind of right now in before we get there. And you mentioned something, you sort of alluded to distracted driving leading to an increase in fatalities. And I think that's sort of interesting because we have this point at which technology is going to make us safer. In the meantime, it might actually be leading to us being less safe. And that's not only true of just driving while using your phone. I think that a very tricky part of this evolution is going to be the part where we have autonomous vehicles on the road, but it's not mature. What is, and I'm wondering kind of what does that look like? What are the intermediary steps when, we already have autonomous vehicles in some cities, they're being tested, but we're going to continue to see an expansion of that. It seems like a difficult thing to do.
So already, if you look at it, you can drive on a highway with automated driving today. Now, there are corner cases, right? But companies like Mobileye are very, very clear. They say, okay, our stuff is only good for the highway. So if you take a self-driving car and you go to Mobileye in Jerusalem, they will drive you on a highway and the things works very well. When they get off the exit, they will take over, okay? So other people have not made that distinction and probably not the safest thing to do. But on a highway, you have that today. So as a use case, I am going long distance and I'm tired. When I'm tired, I'm no longer a safe driver. The driving system can actually take over and help me rest, even though I may have to touch my hand to the wheel. So already you see some of that, right? So this is just a first example of these things being useful. And the reason it's useful is people are buying these things in droves, right? I mean, one of the compelling functionalities of the Tesla is that the highway level autopilot is helping them gain market share against virtually any other luxury car in the world.
So I think we're on two different sides of the spectrum here, like last night.
Yes.
I think there's another.
It's okay to disagree.
I think there's another interesting aspect here. If you look at ride sharing, what's interesting is we know the start and the end of the ride before it happens. And what that allows these services to do is to actually evaluate that ride. So you can look at weather, you can look at time, you can look at the geography of the route itself. You can look at anything that you want prior to actually dispatching that vehicle. So I would actually argue this kind of transportation as a service is a really interesting opportunity for us to apply constraints to slowly allow this technology to evolve. And I think that this is really, really important because over time, I see pockets. A lot of people have been talking about, hey, we're going to see these mechanized vehicles driving all over the place. I don't see that happening in the first couple of years. I see just pockets of this. And you're right, there's cases, Tesla, for example, with autopilot on highway driving, but I think in like the urban areas where you're going to get some public support is where there's a lot of domain constraints, where only when you have high confidence do you start to dispatch these vehicles. And as the vehicles improve over time, I see those pockets growing and growing and growing. And so we see this as this kind of hybrid network. That's kind of how we're evaluating this technology and why we think it's so critical to stitch it into kind of the passenger experience we have today.
And so does that mean that you pick 3 cities and work there, or does that mean you are in many cities and you pick 3 out of every 20 rides?
Yeah, it honestly depends. I think let's just start with one city as an example. And you find a city that's got great weather, that's relatively flat, that has a pretty decent infrastructure. And then you can also look at passengers as well. And so I don't think the first passenger on a Lyft we would necessarily want to provide an autonomous ride, but rather someone who's had multiple rides. And so you kind of cherry pick that audience early on, and then you evolve. And whether it's in one city or multiple cities, it really depends on how you want to scale and what aspects of the technology you're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. So you don't want to shock someone by like, this is my first Lyft ride, and it shows up with an autonomous vehicle.
I don't think anyone in the world of vehicles or transportation wants to shock anyone. I mean, it's number one is safety, second is trust. And so shock is not what we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. And give us a sense of where you guys are testing now, like to the extent that you can tell us.
Yeah, I can't talk about that.
Okay. Charlie, you mentioned an interesting interesting thought that I think relates to this, which is the idea of geofencing, that you would have cars that would be operating, sort of technologically only operate within a specific area. Can you talk a little bit about that idea and why you think it's important?
Sure. I mean, I used to run a robotics company, and one of the sayings was that the biggest enemy of a robot is a human being, right? And mixed mode transportation systems have been prone with failures. I was involved with mixing AGVs and fab workers in semiconductor plants, and that didn't work out so well. So you actually had to run the wafers through the ceiling, which turned out to be the much better solution. Basically, the geofencing idea is that you would go to the edge of a city, and you would park in a parking structure, could be automated one, and then in the inner city or in a retirement facility or a special interest community, you would then take these self-driving taxis, which may be low speed, high speed, but they don't have to deal with human traffic. And so that simplifies the problem. So you can see, I mean, there's many segments of this thing. There's drones, there's logistics vehicles, but you can see progression from highway driving to geofenced automated driving to full automated driving over a bunch of years. So the geofenced driving is, I think, the next big application.
Okay. And so you mentioned over a number of years. I'm just curious, when you guys think about this, the long term, how long does this take before we get to maturity? Like the cars were around for decades before you could say that the societal impact of cars in the United States was clear.
Yeah, we were talking about this last night as well. I think we both agree that it's going to take a very long time. I'm of the opinion that in the next couple of years, we're going to see pockets of these vehicles. But it's also interesting, OEMs are talking about having level 4, level 5 vehicles in 2022, 2023. Those manufacturing cycles are going to be starting around 2018, 2019. And so the hardware and software, mostly the hardware decisions need to be made now. So I think there's a lot of people right now gearing up to start to build these autonomous vehicles. And once we kind of see these in our daily lives, my expectation is that we're going to see a pretty significant ramp up probably after 2024, 2025. But I see kind of this slow scaling pockets till that point. And as that happens, I think the technology is going to evolve as well, where we can actually start talking about level 5 autonomy.
And then you see a sudden acceleration at that point.
I mean, it's anyone's guess. I don't know if I want to say that publicly. But I think it's going to take quite a bit of time. But once you hit that level 5 and you're in all of these cities, people are really going to start to question even owning vehicles. And car ownership is going to be an interesting conversation as well. And that, I think, is just going to further this push into these fleets of autonomous vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Does that sound right to you?
Yes, but so the highway ADAS hardware exists today. The city driving ADAS does not. So we saw a bunch of very interesting research presentations yesterday. Driving through the streets just with cameras and all this stuff. From a mass deployment perspective, the stuff does not exist for city driving today. It's going to be a supercomputer on wheels. It's going to require fusion of LiDAR, radar, cameras. There's just a lot more development that's going on. And so the hardware for that is going to start to be available around 2021. Those are the first time the chips come out. So the hardware decisions are being made now. In fact, one of my friends says the automated car is one of the biggest cash furnaces in the history of high tech, because people are spending billions on this. One, because of the value proposition, but the other thing is that the level of automation has now become a selling point for a car. If you don't have autopilot stuff underway and you get beat out by your competitors, you will lose market share, right? So that's accelerating the adoption, right? So on one hand, what's delaying it is that it's very, very complex, and that the current system, think about what it was like to have roads designed for horses, right? They had to be redesigned for cars, right? That takes a very long time. On the other hand, the competitive pressures are pulling it forward. And so I'm with Taggart. We don't know how it's going to evolve. And we don't know which governments are going to get behind it, which states are going to get behind it. I was talking to someone, I think they were saying that Ontario in Canada is one of the most lenient automated driving governments in North America. And so you can drive an automated car in Ontario. Well, all the people are starting to do research in Ontario, which means ultimately they could actually have a positive impact on that region, right? So there are all kinds of things that are driving this, and we don't know how it's going to evolve. But I agree, full automated impact, I would say 2030, but the business is starting now.
How do we have to design roads differently for automated cars?
So the current technology is based on reading the lines of the roads. Okay, so if all of a sudden the road disappears, the lines disappear, the system has some issues. So I think ultimately we wind up with certain automated driving express lanes, which are allocated to self-driving traffic, things like this. The automated technology has problems with road construction, right? If all of a sudden you throw up a barrier in the middle of a lane, the automated driving car is facing a corner case at that point, and most of them will handle it, but there have been accidents, right? So the roads have to be designed with the cars in mind, and the city driving stuff is a nightmare, right? And so I don't know how that gets redesigned. One of the huge opportunities from a business is that you could actually have electronic infrastructure, right? So instead of having stoplights, the stoplights and the traffic lights become electronic and actually signal to the car, right? So I think for full deployment, you're looking at not only designing the automated car, but you're also looking at redesign of the infrastructure. And that takes a very long time.
Mm-hmm. You guys both mentioned something really interesting, which is the difference between cities and non-cities. The economics of cities are different. Sort of moving away from car ownership makes more sense in cities. In New York, it's already kind of pretty far away from there already. At the same time, the technical problem is much harder in cities. So it seems like where we may end up is a situation in which the difference between living in a city and not living in a city is even bigger than it is today. I'm wondering if you agree with that premise and if you think that's an important thing to think about.
Yeah, I would first say, if you look at, take New York, take San Francisco, there's roughly 700 million parking spaces in the US. That's roughly 6,000 square miles. That's basically the size of Connecticut. There's 250 million vehicles on the road today with a 4% utilization rate, which means there's 240 million out there that are just sitting idly by. Mm-hmm. And there is a huge opportunity for cities to kind of reinvent that space, to recapture that space. I take the ferry every day. I live north of San Francisco, and I walk down the Embarcadero. And a couple years ago, the Embarcadero had a double-decker highway. It was more like 20-some-odd years ago. But the interesting thing is that you've seen this like crazy infrastructure build out for all of these vehicles, for all of these cities, and you potentially have an opportunity to kind of recapture that. And so I walk down this beautiful, Bay Area, and it's because the city has started to kind of recapture some of that land. And I think if we can convince people that, and I don't think it's convincing, I actually think that there's a path there, especially with where we see on-demand ride-sharing and where we see autonomous bringing that cost down, where people are really going to question car ownership, the need for cars, especially in cities like San Francisco, cities like New York. And I agree that this is a complicated area, urban centers, just based on pedestrian traffic, just everything that goes on versus highways. But I think there's this sets of technology, one, integrated cities, smart lanes, kind of this vehicle-to-vehicle communications and even just the speeds where I think we can ensure safety. I do think that in these urban centers is fundamentally where you're going to start to see these vehicles kind of navigating. And I think there's this huge opportunity to help people recognize the pain that it is to have a vehicle in these areas and really kind of rely on kind of this transportation as a service and I think that's where I get really excited. In the more rural areas, that's a harder problem in terms of managing supply, but I still think that that's something that they can solve as well.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that the economics of car ownership will be as undermined in places that aren't very dense urban centers, or do you think that is really something that long-term will stay in play? I mean, you mentioned New York and San Francisco, clearly, sort of the exception cities to everything.
I think the cost is absolutely something that will be questioned in all of those areas. I just think the challenge, if I live, my parents live in Idaho, and they live far away from any transportation center, and so I think it would be a very difficult challenge for them to get rid of one or two of their cars until we can find a way to provide a service that has an ETA of, let's say, 3 minutes or 4 minutes for them, and that's not a trivial problem. But if you look at dense urban areas, that is absolutely something that I would argue is ripe for the picking, especially when you look at the financial burden and costs of a significantly depreciating asset like a vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it was said yesterday that we've reached a peak car, right? And I'm not sure. I think that ultimately a two-car family will have one car, maybe not in inner cities, but in most of the other regions. And the second car will be owned by a fleet that could be Lyft or could be one of the car companies that gets into the ride-sharing business, because I think they have to. Mm-hmm. But one of the other big value propositions that's driving the adoption of this, and I think you touched on this, is asset utilization, right? You talked about parking. But I used to live in France, and France made a very good decision to put up high-speed trains, TGVs. And this is it's a much simpler problem because you're essentially traveling along one dimension. But when the TGVs had a human driver, you could stuff one TGV every 20 minutes on a railroad track. When they fully automated this and essentially turned it into an automatic driving train, which is the current state of the art there today, they could fit, there was 2 minutes of space, right? So they gained 10x the utilization of the tracks. And we could see the same kind of things with the road. So one of the things that's going to drive this, besides the huge human toll of accidents, is much better asset utilization of roads, of parking structures, and I think society is going to be better off.
Mm-hmm. At the moment, Lyft does not commercially operate autonomous cars. They're driven by people. That has always been one of the really interesting parts of Lyft's business, that it created a new market for people who were willing to drive people from place to place and people who needed rides. That's become a fairly significant workforce. They obviously will not be driving the autonomous vehicles. How do you think about the transition from Lyft as a network of humans to potentially an autonomous fleet?
Drivers have always been core to our business, basically part of the family, and I don't actually see this in the short term changing. I actually, especially the adoption curve that we see today, we're actually looking to get more drivers. And so as you see this hybrid, hybrid network where you have autonomous vehicles and drivers, I actually think for a very long time there'll be a significant part of that network. And no one knows really where this goes over 10 years or so, and so we'll have to work through that. But even if you think about accessibility with autonomous vehicles, someone that can't get into a car by themselves or may need help, I still think that there will be services that will be required that will need help. Mm-hmm. And whether those are drivers or other people, TBD. But the other piece that comes with autonomous is fleet management. So cleaning the cars, maintaining the cars, fueling the cars. There's going to be a ton of services that I think pop up as this evolves.
So you think the workforce will change, but that's far enough away that there are too many unknowns to really kind of talk about nuts and bolts with that?
Yeah, I think in the next couple of years we actually see it growing. Over a long enough period of time, we probably see it changing, mm-hmm. evolving into different industries or services.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the other sort of really big questions, business questions with autonomous vehicles is the amount of sort of centralized power we end up with. You know, you guys have a network, but you don't have a fleet. You guys make technology, but you're not making cars. Some of the biggest companies in the world are sort of trying to expand into as many different parts of this business as possible. How much should we be worried that this is going to become like an immense centralized power that will be difficult for businesses to get into and give and socially also cause sort of the problems that go with that?
So I think the automotive industry right now is in the midst of a great disruption, right? And that is because now people, in addition to looking at the cost of the car, the performance of the car, the economy of the car, maybe the quality of the interior, they're now looking at the level of automation that they can get. Mm-hmm. And that's going to open up the industry to a whole bunch of players. And in fact, if, I used to sell to the automotive industry in the early 80s, and it is a very, very conservative industry. And if I was a CEO of Ford or General Motors or Toyota, I would be extremely worried right now because my key guys are engine designers. I don't have a very strong programming force. I have plants that are built toward manufacturing complex gas engines and gas-based chassis where clearly some of this, at least, if not all of it's going to move to electric. And I have a dealer channel that makes most of its money from maintenance and is disincentivized from selling electric cars, which are essentially cost much less to maintain. So there is a great set of challenges. And then I have people like Lyft, where ultimately Lyft could become my biggest customer because they may buy more cars than Hertz or any of this, right? So this poses tremendous challenge for the current players in the market, and some of them will make the transition successfully, but some will not. And you can already see as we said yesterday, the president of Ford, CEO of Ford, being replaced with the head of their automated driving division, right? So I think the existing guys come under pressure, and who will be the power? I don't know. I mean, if a Taggart scenario comes out, it could be Lyft or Uber, right? But we don't know. But to make the transition that the car companies have to face is not a simple thing. It requires very, very tough and very aggressive management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be one big power. One analogy would be looking at the airline industry, where potentially where this goes is instead of planes, OEMs are manufacturing vehicles, but then there's an experience that's placed on top of that. So imagine Virgin America as an example. They don't manufacture the planes, they kind of manufacture the experience. And that's where I think this actually gets interesting because you're gonna see more people get into this space than fewer. And I think a good example of that would be if I'm at our office and I'm on a call, I should be able to request a Lyft, go downstairs, hop into that car, and that car should know that I'm on the phone. That car should be able to tint the windows. The car should be able to drive in a steady fashion, in a muted fashion, and my phone should automatically just tie into the vehicle itself. So now I can use the mics and the speakers in the phone on the vehicle. So I think there's a really interesting piece here where we can start to think about the integrated experience, and it goes even beyond that. You could start to think about maybe it's 5 o'clock on Friday and I'm heading home and I want to listen to some music, or better yet, Netflix knows that I just finished some episode and Lyft knows that it's a 30-minute ride, and so Netflix is going to pump in the next episode of Master of None, and I'm going to go ahead and watch it. So I think that you're not going to have a single person own this. I do think that the relationships are going to change here as this kind of technology evolves, but I also see more players coming in and really kind of focusing on reimagining the experience that we know today.
Mm-hmm. So let's assume that technologically we're going to solve the outstanding problems and get there in the next couple of decades. what do you think are the biggest non-technological threats to getting to the vision that you guys have been laying out?
I think one of the big things would be inconsistent government regulation, right? I was just in China at an automotive driving conference, and there, for example, they were talking about setting a different safety standard than ISO 262. That would make things a little ugly. So regulation is one. Another is a stochastic event, like a massive, multi-person car crash caused by automated driving. There's a lot of things, but the economics of the accident prevention and asset utilization are going to make this an idea whose time has come, and there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come.
Yeah, I'd agree. Patchwork of policies that we'd have to work through. I think the other thing is just the being hypercritical over events. So if you see an accident, the kind of social ramifications of that, and we'll have to work through that as well. But these are things that could potentially slow down the adoption of this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a couple more minutes. I'd like to see if anyone has any questions. Would love to hear some from you, and I'll stop talking. So someone's with the mic, and
my name is Miroslav. I am from Zebra Technologies. I live in Long Island, and where I work, most people commute 15 to 30 minutes. So now there's been this theme that with autonomous vehicles, there's going to be increase in ride sharing. And I shared a ride a couple of times, and the overhead is just quite big. So meaning like either I have to wait for somebody or they have to wait for me. And on 15 minutes or 20 minutes commute, if you had 10 minutes overhead, that's just too much. So why do you think that the ride share is going to increase that much with autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, because I think we're going to continue to improve that service. And so the experience that you have today, in the future, whether it is scheduled through your calendar integration or we've just gotten to a point where we've optimized that service, you're going to see those 10, 15, 20 minutes that you just described go down to a few minutes, if that. And I also think from a price perspective that it's going to be worth your while, not to mention it gets to the point where it's just going to be more efficient if we can find a way to get you from point A to point B. When you get into the city, you don't have to worry about parking. You don't have to worry about any challenges that you would if you were driving in yourself. And so, yes, there's a few trade-offs there, but as we kind of improve the service, I think you'll see some of those pains that you talk about today drop dramatically.
Hi. So this question applies certainly to autonomous drivers being added to your fleet, but possibly even perhaps to the human drivers that you have now. I'm very curious. How do you all think about or factor in disabled customers, customers that have wheelchairs or are facing other challenges in getting around? I have a dear friend who has MS, whose brain functions perfectly, but he's kind of locked into his house most of the time with very few options for transportation. And it seems to me that autonomous vehicles could open up some really great solutions and services for that sort of community. So I wonder if that factors in at all at this point.
It absolutely does. And even today, non-emergency medical transport, we actually work with hospitals to provide lifts to patients that cannot drive themselves. And so we actually have that today as part of our service, and that's a huge aspect of why we do this. Our mission is to improve people's lives through the world's best transportation, and I think that fundamentally means your friend as well. From an autonomous perspective, I don't think the car itself is going to necessarily solve it. The thing that we'll have to work through is how do we get your friend into the car? And so it may be that we'll need to add someone, and I was kind of talking about this today. You have people driving cars. Maybe tomorrow there's cars that have facilitators as well that will go in, that will help people get into those vehicles, and that's kind of how we evolve. But I think that that's key, and one of the big reasons why I'm so excited working at Lyft is that we are starting to solve some of these challenges today.
Yeah, it's not just the disabled community. Think about all the aging people who no longer have the skills to drive, the 80-year-old grandmother, right? 85-year-old grandmother who's shut in her apartment and is relying on other people to bring in food and all this stuff, the automated driving would actually extend people's independence for a significant number of years. And that's an even bigger market than helping disabled people gain some level of mobility back.
Asher Beg from Huawei. I have a question about the cost of these cars. It's going to go up quite a bit because the parts that are used today are built to last 3 to 5 years or 100,000, 150,000 miles. But now these cars are going to be picking up passengers all day long. We'll be driving million-plus miles a year. So the parts that you're going to use in these cars are obviously going to be able to support that number of miles, and obviously the car's cost is going to go up 2 or 3 times. And the second part of the question is the brand itself. When I order a Lyft or an Uber, I really don't care if a Cadillac shows up or a Lincoln or a Mercedes. I just want a black car or a white car, a small car or a big car with tinted windows, that type of stuff. So the brand, what's your comment on the brand value as well as the cost of these self-driving cars?
I'll take the brand if you take the car.
Very good.
Awesome. Look at
Deal.
that. We're friends already. I actually think the brand continues, and it's going to be this experience. Today I have an SUV. Why? Because sometimes I go up to Tahoe. What I really want is, on an occasion, when I go up to the mountains or if I try to go skiing, I'm going to want an SUV, and I'm going to want a size that fits, let's say, my family. If I want to go into town and let's say there's some event and I want to take a black car, it may be that I want to take, let's say the BMW experience or the Mercedes experience. I still think that brand absolutely matters. It may just change what that brand is and focus more on what's the experience that I want as a passenger. And that's where I think actually this whole on-demand aspect is quite interesting. We were talking about this last night, but when you take car ownership out of the picture, I can actually start to select a whole different type of experience. I may want to have the race car being that, maybe on a Thursday night, I actually want to drive myself home, and so I get a vehicle that allows me to do that. It may be that I'm extremely tired and I'm commuting in and I want kind of the sleep car. So I think the brand will still be there. It's just going to be more focused on, I think, the experience versus the icon on the outside of the vehicle.
So in terms of the cost, the automotive industry has always been very, very cost conscious, right? So what we're talking about is automating the car at the lowest cost possible. And so what is that? What is the acceptable cost? So there's multiple segments of this, right? So for the consumer segment, my opinion is that the cost ultimately will be somewhere between probably $7,000 to $10,000 adder. Right, so you'll be basically buying a $7,000 to maybe $7,000 to $9,000 self-driving option. That's just a guess, because the chips are much more complex. There's many more of them. So, for example, right now the average electronic content of a car is about $300 per car, $400. When you're looking at automated driving, particularly with the city driving ADAS, you throw in LiDAR and all this stuff, you're going to have $3,000 to $4,000 just of electronics, and you have to pay for the software and the R&D and all that stuff. So my guess, and it's just a guess, is something like $7,000 to $10,000 adder. For the self-driving car that's being used for ride sharing, like at Lyft, which is used, say, 12 hours a day or something like this, you can probably pay $50,000, right? Because the economics will prevent that. And so what's interesting is you may have a different electronic solution for the person who actually is going to be required to do some driving versus the fully automated taxi. So there's going to be different ranges for different segments. And as far as the vehicle reliability, there is no reason why an electric car, which doesn't have a transmission, doesn't have an exhaust system, can't last 200,000 miles with a relatively low cost. I mean, You look at the architecture of the Tesla or even the new Porsche Mission E or something like this. The parts content is way lower than the gas car. So the reliability of the mechanics can go up substantially. What I'm worried about is the reliability of the electronics, because you need to have things working securely, safely for 10 years.
Okay. We're going to leave it there.
Yes.
Thank you guys both. Thank you, everybody. And